Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Senate is expected to release its version of the reconciliation bill this week, while it also takes up the House-passed rescission bill and tries to deal with foreign affairs. WTOP Capitol Hill correspondent Mitchell Miller joins me to explain how they'll keep all of those plates spinning. Mitchell, thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely.
So we're about 3 months out from the 4th of July, and that's a big marker on the congressional calendar for the reconciliation bill, or the mega bill, as it's being called. What are you hearing?
Well, there is a lot of nervousness among Republicans, and certainly Democrats are trying to push back on a lot of things, but they really don't have any power. But despite all the drama that's been taking place recently, I do think that Senate Majority Leader John Thune feels like he is keeping things on track. And of course, there were a lot of questions about that when there was that big blow-up between President Trump and Elon Musk. There are certainly a lot of things in the gears right now, especially related to the tax cuts and which tax cuts are going to be altered or made permanent, as well as Medicaid. There's some nervousness among Republicans in red states who want to know that Medicaid is not going to be cut too deeply. But there have been frequent meetings between GOP leaders and the president. He's much more involved in this process than he was in his first term. And I do think that they feel like, at least right now, that with 3 weeks to go, that they are essentially on track for that July 4th deadline. They want to get it all done, of course, right before the big holiday, and then say they have this done as we head into the summer. However, as with Congress, you never know what's going to happen over the next few weeks. And Senate Majority Leader Thune has said he would hold over lawmakers if they don't get things done. And of course, we'll have to then see, even if the Senate does get this passed, what will happen when it bounces back to the House, because there's going to be a lot of issues with the SALT tax and all these other issues that Republicans want to cut more deeply. Are they going to try to tinker with things at the very last minute as we get into the heavy part of the summer?
Right. Then they have to bring the reconciliation bill back into the reconciliation process, right?
Right, exactly. And then you have the rescissions package, which was passed last week by the House, $9.4 billion, which are essentially DOGE cuts. And you'll recall that DOGE really went after foreign aid, and specifically USAID. These are largely from that, about $8 billion related to that. And then you had more than $1 billion in cuts for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which, of course, provides funding for PBS and NPR. That goes to the Senate, and the Senate is probably going to take that up sometime in July, and we'll have to see what happens with that.
Well, there's rumor going around that OMB is considering another approach called pocket rescissions to withhold even more spending in advance of congressional approval. Have you heard anything about that?
Yes, this is getting a lot of buzz on Capitol Hill right now. Russ Vought, who is, if nothing else, very creative when it comes to budgetary matters, he is looking at these pocket rescissions, which essentially when Congress overall appropriates, but the money doesn't actually get spent, that's where it goes into this rescission process. And that's what allowed the White House to say, hey, we want to claw back this more than $9 billion. And what Vought is saying is he'd like to hold back some of this money that has technically not been spent yet for various agencies, including OMB and others, and see if they can claw back more of that DOGE money. There's been a lot of talk among Republican appropriators about whether they could do this because they said, hey, DOGE did all this work. We want to stop the spending now. However, there have been some red flags raised, among them Idaho Republican Mike Simpson, who sits on the Interior Environment Subcommittee. He has said he does not like the idea. There are some Republicans that just don't think that the power of the purse should be ripped into yet again, even though these are largely GOP initiatives that are moving forward.
Well, it will be really interesting to see who the referees are in throwing those red flags and whether there's a penalty call on the field for this.
Absolutely. And of course, you've got the Senate parliamentarian, speaking of umpires, who has to determine on the budget reconciliation process separately whether or not these things can go through the so-called Byrd bath, named after Senator Byrd, the late senator from West Virginia, on all these technical issues about whether or not it is really a spending matter or is it something else that a party is trying to push through as a policy matter.
Right. We never thought we'd be so concerned about parliamentarian rules, but on this bill, it really is going to have an impact on particular provisions.
Absolutely.
I'm speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's the Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Well, Mitchell, let's shift gears just a little bit because foreign policy has made a big comeback in the last week or so. How is that changing the focus of the folks on the Hill from all of these other spending issues?
You know, they have so many things going on right now that it is hard, as I mentioned earlier, for Senate Majority Leader John Thune to keep things on track, particularly in the Senate, because foreign policy issues really resonate very heavily with a lot of Republican senators. And we saw that this past week in connection with Ukraine. Now, of course, right now we're dealing with what's happening in the Middle East and what's going to happen with Israel and Iran. Certainly a lot of concern among lawmakers there. Many things can happen over the next days and weeks. But you also saw concern related to Ukraine when Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth came up to the Hill, and Republicans were really hitting him hard on the issue of Ukraine about what is going to happen there now that it seems like President Trump has lost interest in trying to get some kind of a deal between Russia and Ukraine. Now I think they're going to also be focusing on this Middle East issue. Does that slow down things for the budgetary process? We'll have to see. You know, they like to say we can do two things at once. In this case, lawmakers have to do many things at once, and I'll be interested to see if they stay focused as much as they have been on the budgetary process.
Well, in addition to foreign policy, there have been some really interesting turns of events related to federal civilian personnel. As we saw with the beginning of the Trump administration, hundreds of thousands of feds released from work now being called back. Is Congress paying attention to that, and do they have anything to say about it?
You know, it's interesting. I think the Democrats are probably more closely following this because they've been involved with all these legal cases. But, you know, very quietly, or at least quietly to many in Congress, the number of agencies that have been rehiring people has really continued to increase. You have the IRS, the FDA, HUD, State Department, even the National Weather Service has been hiring after some complaints from lawmakers about cuts. And in that case, it was Republicans who were raising some flags about that. But while the rehiring has been taking place, some federal workers, as you know, have decided they do not want to come back. So that means those that are still in these agencies that have really been cut, they sometimes have to work overtime. They have to take on new job responsibilities, decide whether or not they are going to fill some of these holes that have clearly been left by these losses of tens of thousands of people.
Well, and the IRS is another one that's bringing people back. And their new chief was just on the Hill to testify about the success in the IRS, right?
Right. And the new IRS commissioner, former Missouri Congressman Billy Long, he really has a huge job ahead of him, as you know. I mean, the agency is trying to pare out tens of thousands of positions, and many of them are in IT, as Federal News Network has reported. That's obviously a huge issue. Technically, we've talked about it for years with the IRS about trying to modernize, and now they've had this brain drain. So Long had a lot of tough questions from lawmakers before he was ultimately confirmed, among them the fact that he actually once proposed abolishing the IRS. And now, does he have the expertise, the wherewithal to kind of get the IRS redefined? Of course, many Republicans want to see the IRS really reformed in a lot of ways, and that's why they have pulled back on all those employees that were originally approved by Congress under the Biden administration.
So there's a lot happening. What will you be watching for this coming week?
Well, I'm going to see how all these issues related to the tax cuts and Medicaid and everything related to the mega bill, as we're talking about it, are really going to start coming into play. And as you mentioned, will they get pulled away a little bit by these events in the Middle East and other things that are happening, of course, with immigration and all of the other things? It's really a lot of cars to keep on the track for Senate Majority Leader John Thune. So it will only be the Senate this week. The House is out. So that will allow them perhaps to focus a little bit more without some of the noise as some of the lawmakers in the Senate consider it from the House side. So it's going to be yet another interesting week as we bear down on this big deadline coming up in July.
Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Thanks for joining me.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.